Good morning. My name is Michael Leahy of the Irish Freedom Party. I want to talk to you today about our lockdown, whether it's been effective, whether it's been justified, and how we can get out of it. Yesterday, the 7th of April, the government signed into law legislation which is the most draconian legislation we in Ireland have ever experienced, involving mandatory lockdowns within 2 kilometres of your homes and giving the Gardaí wide powers of arrest for people who are breaching the lockdown, which was instituted nearly 2 weeks ago. Most people are happy to accept that this is a public health emergency, and for that reason they're prepared to comply with the new draconian legislation. They believe that our Constitution, and correctly that our Constitution, does give the government a right in certain circumstances to introduce legislation which in the normal course of events would never be acceptable. They also believe that the government is acting decisively in dealing with a serious crisis. However, I would like to put forward a somewhat different interpretation. I believe that the government has acted in a precipitate manner, that it has not taken adequate cognizance of the real nature of this pandemic, and that in fact they're showing signs of panic rather than level-headedness. They're acting on the basis that this is a crisis and that something needs to be done. They're now doing something, and that's better than doing nothing. What is difficult, however, is that there is no evidence that what they're doing is the most effective response to the crisis in hand. Nor does their lockdown strategy take into account the very significant downstream economic impacts that it's going to have and the very significant health impacts that this may have. This is in many ways a reflection of our media-driven culture. For years we have witnessed how governments are frequently dragooned into action against the best interest of the country because of media pressure. No media ever condemns a government for introducing excessively draconian powers. They do condemn them if they are seen to be engaged in inaction and they demand more and tougher legislation. But this is not always the best way to proceed. There are many circumstances where a lack of action may be more appropriate than an action which involves panic and which does a great deal of damage. However, many very eminent epidemiologists, such as Dr. Sakid Bhakti of Mainz University and Dr. John Ioannidis of Stanford University, believe that the actual mortality rates from the COVID-19 virus may be no more than a normal epidemic of flu, perhaps slightly more, but not excessively more. Many other countries, including Sweden, South Korea, and Singapore, have decided to fight this virus without a lockdown, and their rates are very similar to ours so far. What we have not taken into account is the very negative impacts of the lockdown. And I'm not just talking about economic impacts, I'm talking also about psychological impacts, in particularly on the well elderly population. The elderly population needs access, it needs access to people, it needs access to company. And without the things that make their life meaningful, there can be severe psychological trauma, which results in depression and premature death. We also need to take into account the serious economic implications of what we're doing in terms of lockdown. Many small businesses will simply not be able to survive a lengthy, protracted lockdown period, and these businesses will not survive. The impact of that on the overall economy will be catastrophic, but it will also be catastrophic on the individual lives of hard-working, honest people who have taken many years to build up their businesses and now see them completely destroyed for no reason for which they can be held accountable. This is wrong. We also have to take into account the enormous cost to the revenue and to the government of the lockdown proposals in terms of income supplement, social welfare, and so on and so forth. And we must be aware that this is going to have to be paid for later on in downstream taxation. We are crashing the economy, and I wonder, do we really understand what an economic crash is like? What happens in an economic crash has been witnessed in many countries recently, including Russia and Argentina, where highly educated and skilled people end up working for very low, if any, wages, selling their property in order to be able to buy bread. We must be very cognizant that this is something that we could be bringing upon ourselves, and we must take that into account in determining what our strategy is going to be. It has been correctly stated that in this case, the cure may be far worse than the disease. And there's no dichotomy here between protecting the economy and protecting human life. If you destroy the economy, you're not going to be able to afford a health service. You're not going to be able to afford a social welfare system. And if these collapse, the consequences in human life will be equally catastrophic to anything that the COVID-19 virus could bring upon us. During this entire process, the Dáil has been effectively absent. There has been no significant debate. The most draconian legislation we have ever witnessed was passed in 2 days in both the Dáil and the Shannon. This is quite unprecedented, and it indicates that the full implications of what we're proposing have not been adequately taken into account by government. We are now in a situation where government is being carried out effectively by public health officials. And they're not giving us any clear indication of what the difference is between dying with the virus and dying from the virus. The level of mortality so far has not been excessive, certainly no more excessive than would take place in a normal flu epidemic. I want to put forward a better strategy for dealing with this situation later in this video. But there's one other thing I need to mention, and that is the loss of freedom. Loss of freedom is no small matter. While we're prepared to accept a limitation on our freedom in a crisis situation, we should be aware that coercive legislation tends to be rather sticky, and governments are rather fond of holding on to coercive legislation once they've introduced it. Most worrying of all, as far as I'm concerned, is how this legislation may be reformatted to deal with another crisis, for example, the completely fake crisis of global warming. Many environmentalists in this country and internationally, who are now part of the hard left, have been highly opportunistic in indicating how well we're doing now that the economy has slowed down to such an extent, pointing out the clear air and so on and so forth. Many of them appear to me to be salivating at the opportunity to close down an economy and to bring us back to the Stone Age utopia that they have for long sought. I also find it very worrying the ease with which coercive legislation has been introduced and been operated by the people without question. It is necessary for us to question the activities of government, and it is necessary for us to determine whether the legislation is appropriate. Another interesting feature has also emerged, and that is the complete absence of European Union solidarity during this crisis. Every European country, even Ireland, long one of the most slavish subject states of the European Union, has reverted to an understanding of the importance of the nation and of national boundaries. The European Union has always sold itself as an international body which is necessary to deal with international crises. But its only role so far has been threatening Italy with sanctions for dealing with the health emergency in its country, and condemning states such as Hungary and Poland, which so quickly closed their borders. Indeed, if we had closed our borders somewhat earlier, the crisis might be on a much lesser level in this country. But because of our attachment to European Union policy, we didn't do so. It is necessary for us to develop an exit strategy for lockdown. I believe that a far more sensible approach to dealing with the crisis would be to identify those at severe risk, the elderly, those with immune deficiencies and so on and so forth, and concentrate our efforts on protecting them while allowing the remainder of the economy to function. We called on the government to put forward a plan for ending the lockdown as quickly as possible. The only purpose of a lockdown originally was to buy time, and otherwise its only effect may be to extend the duration of this crisis. Allowing the economy to function, allowing people to go about their daily work, may allow a certain level of immunity to develop within society. This is an approach which has been taken by other countries, and it may be the correct one. There is no doubt that these are difficult times, but it is important to keep our heads and to ensure that our actions are based on sensible, level-headed policies. It's far too easy for government to use crisis as a means of attacking liberty, and this may not be an appropriate course of action to take. Also, the people need to hold government to account. In the absence of a functioning press which refuses to ask difficult questions, either of our government or our health officials, in the absence of a functioning Dáil which refuses to debate some of the most extraordinary legislation we've ever seen, individuals need to hold government to account. Individuals and smaller parties, such as the Irish Freedom Party, must make their voices heard at this stage. I call on all people to contact their local representatives and express concern and seek to have an exit strategy from this lockdown, which could be catastrophic in the long term for the welfare of this country. Thank you for listening. This has been Michael Leahy of the Irish Freedom Party.